Ethan Jameson was the embodiment of the American dream. A self-made billionaire, he had built Jameson Enterprises from the ground up, transforming it into a global conglomerate spanning luxury hotels, tech innovations, and high-end real estate. Born in a modest neighborhood in Chicago, he worked tirelessly to reach the pinnacle of success. By his mid-30s, he had a reputation as a visionary businessman with the Midas touch. Every venture he touched seemed to flourish. The media adored him. He graced magazine covers, attended exclusive business summits, and was hailed as a financial genius. With his tailored suits, polished charm, and confident stride, he commanded every room he entered. His name carried weight in boardrooms, political circles, and high society alike. Yet, beyond the business world, Ethan was also known for something else: his seemingly perfect marriage to Charlotte Harrington Jameson. Charlotte was the daughter of Robert Harrington, a real estate mogul who had built an empire that spanned across the United States. Beautiful, poised, and intelligent, she had grown up in luxury but never let it define her. Instead, she had devoted herself to philanthropy, using her status to champion causes such as women's shelters, children's hospitals, and education initiatives. Dubbed the Swan of Manhattan by high society, Charlotte's elegance and grace captivated all who met her. Her marriage to Ethan was seen as a fairy tale, the power couple who had it all. Their wedding, held at the Ritz-Carlton, had been one of the most talked about events of the decade, attended by celebrities, politicians, and business tycoons. Their love story seemed straight out of a romance novel. The self-made billionaire and the heiress, two worlds colliding to create an unstoppable force. When news broke that Charlotte was pregnant, the media frenzy intensified. Magazine covers speculated about baby names, nursery designs, and even potential godparents. Photographers camped outside Manhattan's top OBGYN clinics, hoping to capture the couple leaving a doctor's appointment together. Socialites gushed over Charlotte's maternity fashion, and baby brands scrambled to sponsor what would undoubtedly be the most high-profile birth of the year. But behind closed doors, the cracks in their picture-perfect life had already begun to form. Charlotte noticed the first signs of change in Ethan long before the tabloids ever suspected trouble. It started with small things: missed dinner plans, unanswered text messages, a distant look in his eyes. At first, she told herself it was just stress. After all, Ethan was at the helm of a billion-dollar empire. Long hours and high-pressure deals were part of the job. But then the excuses became more frequent, more vague. His last-minute business trips to London, Paris, and Chicago didn't always align with the company's official schedule. His once affectionate texts grew cold and infrequent, replaced with short, dismissive replies. Even during their rare moments together, Ethan was distracted. He spent more time on his phone than engaging with her, his eyes scanning emails and messages with an intensity that Charlotte could no longer ignore. He had once been a hands-on husband, always involved in their future plans. But now he was barely present. And then came the biggest red flag. Ethan had stopped accompanying her to doctor's appointments. Throughout the early months of her pregnancy, Charlotte had imagined Ethan sitting beside her, his fingers laced with hers as they listened to their baby's heartbeat. But reality was far different. Instead, she often sat in the waiting room alone, watching other couples celebrate milestones together. Ethan always had an excuse: an urgent meeting, an international call, an investment that couldn't wait. Her father, Robert Harrington, noticed the shift as well. Over dinner one evening, he placed a firm hand on her shoulder and spoke in that deep, steady voice she had grown up respecting. He had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke, he meant it. He asked if Ethan was treating her right, if things between them were okay. Charlotte forced a smile, pretending everything was fine. She didn't want to admit to herself, or to anyone else, that her dream marriage might be falling apart. While Charlotte tried to ignore the growing distance, others had already begun whispering. Ethan's personal assistant, Alyssa Carter, had worked for him for nearly 7 years. A sharp, efficient woman in her late 20s, Alyssa had built a reputation as Ethan's right-hand person. She scheduled his meetings, managed his travel, and knew more about his daily movements than anyone, including Charlotte. But recently things weren't adding up. Alyssa had noticed meeting locations that didn't match official business schedules. She processed floral delivery receipts for a mysterious woman, always sent to a high-end penthouse at the Belmont Hotel. She even spotted a designer handbag Valentino, not Charlotte's style, sitting in Ethan's office late one night. Then one afternoon, while printing Ethan's corporate expense reports, something caught her eye. A series of lavish restaurant bills, all for 2 guests, none of which were booked through her. Her heart pounded. She knew what she was seeing, but she also knew the risks of crossing Ethan Jameson. So, instead of confronting him, she approached Charlotte. The 2 women crossed paths in the executive lounge of Jameson Enterprises. Charlotte, visibly tired from pregnancy, was rubbing her lower back when Alyssa hesitantly stepped forward. She hesitated before speaking, her voice laced with something Charlotte couldn't quite place. Concern, perhaps? A warning? Alyssa simply told her that if she ever needed anything, she was there. Charlotte's weary eyes flickered with something, hope maybe? Or suspicion. She didn't press for more, but the weight in Alyssa's voice told her everything she needed to know. Something was wrong. Charlotte might have dismissed her worries as paranoia, if not for what happened next. A young bellhop, Anthony Ramirez, worked at the Belmont Hotel, where he often saw Manhattan's elite slipping in and out of private suites. One evening, while restocking towels in the penthouse level, Anthony froze in his tracks. At the far end of the hallway, the elevator door slid open, and stepping out into the dimly lit corridor was none other than Ethan Jameson, his arm wrapped around a stunning brunette in a silk robe. Anthony's stomach dropped. He recognized Ethan immediately. After all, he had seen Charlotte Jameson at charity galas, praising her husband. He had witnessed her glowing in the media, speaking about how much Ethan loved their child. And yet, here Ethan was with another woman. The woman whispered something and Ethan smirked, clearly unconcerned about being seen. Anthony's blood boiled. He couldn't just let this go. He had seen good people crushed under the weight of powerful men like Ethan, and he had no intention of standing by and letting it happen again. So he pulled out his phone and snapped a picture. Later that night, as Charlotte sat in bed scrolling through baby names, her phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number appeared on her screen. It was brief, but it changed everything. Someone claimed to have proof that her husband was cheating. Her breath hitched as she opened the attached image. It was Ethan stepping out of the elevator, his hand placed intimately on the lower back of a woman who was most definitely not his wife. Charlotte stared at the image, her entire world crumbling in a single second. For months she had ignored the warning signs. She had made excuses. She had held on to hope. But now there was no denying it anymore. Her perfect marriage was a lie. Charlotte Jameson sat frozen, staring at the screen of her phone. The image before her was undeniable. Her husband, Ethan, standing in the dimly lit hallway of the Belmont Hotel, his arm around another woman. The woman was beautiful, draped in a silk robe, her expression smug, as if she knew exactly what she was doing. Charlotte's heart pounded in her chest, a sharp, relentless rhythm that drowned out every other sound in the room. She had spent months trying to ignore the signs. She told herself that Ethan's frequent absences were a necessary sacrifice for their future, that his distant behavior was a result of work stress, that his missed doctor's appointments weren't a reflection of how he felt about their unborn child. But now, staring at the proof, she felt the weight of reality crash down upon her. Charlotte set her phone down carefully on the bedside table, as if handling something fragile. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, but the tightness in her chest remained. The betrayal was suffocating. She had given Ethan everything, her love, her trust, and soon their child. And in return, he had given his affection to someone else. A sharp kick from inside her belly pulled her out of her thoughts. Instinctively, she placed a hand over her stomach, as if shielding her baby from the storm that was about to unfold. Her child was innocent in all of this, yet it would be the one to suffer the consequences of Ethan's lies. The weight of that realization strengthened her resolve. She would not allow Ethan to destroy their future. She would not be the woman who stood by silently while her husband publicly humiliated her. If Ethan thought he could keep his affair hidden, if he believed she would simply accept his betrayal, he was sorely mistaken. The next morning Charlotte dressed carefully, choosing a sleek black coat that concealed her growing belly. She wrapped a soft gray scarf around her neck and pulled her hair into a neat bun. Today was not a day for dramatics. Today was a day for strategy. She arrived at a quiet cafe downtown, one that had private booths tucked away from prying eyes. Seated in the corner, looking slightly nervous, was Anthony Ramirez, the hotel bellhop who had sent her the message. He looked up as she approached, immediately rising to his feet. "Mrs. Jameson," he said, his voice laced with hesitation. "It's an honor to meet you." Charlotte forced a polite smile and gestured for him to sit. "Please just call me Charlotte," she said as she slid into the seat across from him. Anthony nodded, stirring his coffee with unnecessary focus. I wasn't sure if I should reach out, but I recognized your husband. I knew I had to do something." Charlotte appreciated his sincerity, but she needed facts. "Tell me everything you know," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos inside her. Anthony hesitated, then pulled out his phone and scrolled through his photos. He handed it to her, revealing not just the image he had already sent but several others. Ethan arriving at the hotel late at night, leaving in the early hours of the morning, always with the same woman. "Her name is Vanessa Rousseau," Anthony explained. "She claims to be an art dealer, but I've seen her with some very powerful men before. She knows exactly what she's doing." Charlotte studied the photos carefully. Vanessa was stunning, with striking features and an air of confidence that suggested she was used to getting what she wanted. And right now what she wanted was Ethan. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. "At least 6 months," Anthony admitted. "I've seen them together too many times for it to be casual." Charlotte set the phone down, pressing her fingers against her temple. 6 months. That meant Ethan had started this affair while she was newly pregnant. While she had been planning their future, he had been sneaking off to luxury hotels with another woman. She exhaled slowly, forcing the rising anger back down. "Thank you for coming forward," she said, sliding a discreet envelope across the table. "I appreciate your honesty." Anthony hesitated before accepting it. "I just thought you deserved to know," he said. Charlotte offered a tight nod before rising from her seat. She had what she needed. Now it was time to decide what to do with it. By the time she returned to her father's penthouse, she had already made her decision. She needed to speak with Margaret Lee, the family's longtime legal counsel. If Ethan thought he could keep his double life hidden, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. Margaret met her in a private law office near Central Park, greeting her with a warm but serious expression. "Charlotte, I was hoping I wouldn't have to see you under these circumstances," she said, ushering her into the sleek conference room. Charlotte wasted no time. "I want to know my rights," she said, pulling out the printed copies of the photos Anthony had given her. "I'm not making any rash decisions yet, but I need to be prepared." Margaret's eyes darkened as she flipped through the images. "This is serious," she said. "Infidelity, especially during pregnancy, can have a major impact on divorce proceedings. Not to mention the public image aspect. If this goes public, Ethan could lose everything." Charlotte met her gaze evenly. "Good." Margaret leaned back in her chair. "Are you considering a divorce?" "I don't know," Charlotte admitted, "but I want options." And I want to protect my child. Margaret nodded. Then we start gathering evidence. We track financial records, we see if Ethan has been diverting money to Vanessa. And most importantly, we make sure that when you make your move, you have the upper hand. Charlotte exhaled, feeling a sense of control return to her. She wasn't just reacting to Ethan's betrayal. She was preparing for war. The days that followed were filled with careful planning. Margaret's team discreetly began investigating Ethan's finances, uncovering troubling discrepancies. He had been funneling money from Jameson Enterprises into Vanessa's supposed art investments, but much of the money had disappeared into offshore accounts. Charlotte felt a bitter sense of satisfaction. Ethan hadn't just betrayed her. He had compromised his own company for Vanessa. His arrogance had blinded him, and now he was about to lose everything. The perfect opportunity presented itself at a charity gala hosted at the Ritz-Carlton. Charlotte had helped organize the event, dedicated to funding women's shelters across New York. Ethan, of course, was expected to attend, and as if he couldn't help himself, Vanessa was there too. Charlotte watched from across the room as Vanessa draped herself over Ethan, whispering in his ear, laughing at his every word. The guests around them exchanged uncertain glances, some whispering, some pretending not to notice. But Charlotte knew that all eyes were on them. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, greeting donors, shaking hands, never letting her mask slip. But when it was time for her speech, she made sure Ethan was watching. Standing beneath the glittering chandeliers, she spoke about the importance of women's empowerment, about providing safe spaces for those in need. And then she let her words sharpen. It is our duty to stand against those who exploit, deceive, and manipulate, she said, letting her gaze flicker toward Ethan. Because no woman, especially a pregnant woman, should ever feel abandoned or betrayed by those who claim to love her. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan stiffened, his jaw tightening, while Vanessa's smirk wavered. The message was clear. After the speech, Charlotte made her way toward the exit, but Ethan caught up with her, his grip firm on her arm. "What the hell was that?" he hissed. Charlotte turned slowly, meeting his furious gaze with a cold, unwavering stare. "That," she said, her voice steady, "was just the beginning." Ethan barely had time to react before the cameras flashed, capturing the moment. Charlotte standing strong, defiant. Ethan looking like a man who had just realized he was about to lose everything. That night, the headlines wrote themselves. Billionaire Ethan Jameson exposed. Pregnant wife confronts his affair at charity gala. Charlotte watched the news unfold from the comfort of her father's penthouse, sipping tea as Margaret handed her the finalized divorce papers. "Are you ready?" Margaret asked. Charlotte glanced down at her growing belly, then back at the documents. "More than ever," she said. With a steady hand, she signed her name, sealing Ethan's fate. He had chosen his mistress over his wife. Now he would face the consequences. Ethan Jameson had built his empire with relentless ambition, but in a single moment, he had undone everything. The image of Charlotte, standing strong at the charity gala while exposing his betrayal, was plastered across every major news outlet. The scandal was no longer whispered about in private circles. It had exploded into the public eye, and now there was no escaping it. Headlines flooded the internet within hours. Ethan Jameson's double life exposed, billionaire caught in cheating scandal, and power couple no more. Charlotte Jameson's stunning public showdown dominated the news cycle. The photos taken at the event painted a clear picture. Ethan caught off guard, his grip tight on Charlotte's arm. Charlotte, poised and unshaken, looking at him with cold detachment. The world had witnessed the moment Ethan lost control. Inside his penthouse, Ethan paced the floor, his hands clenched into fists. His phone buzzed constantly. Calls from reporters, board members, and his legal team. Investors were panicking. Stock prices were slipping, and Jameson Enterprises was facing a PR disaster. His carefully curated image, the one that had kept him untouchable, had shattered. But Ethan's problems were far greater than the headlines. The fallout had only just begun. Charlotte had remained silent after the gala, refusing to comment publicly. She didn't need to. Her message had already been received loud and clear. Instead, she focused on the next steps, ensuring that Ethan faced consequences beyond just social disgrace. While the media fixated on the scandal, she worked quietly with her legal team, gathering evidence that would not only secure her divorce but ensure Ethan had no control over her or their unborn child's future. Margaret Lee had wasted no time. Within 24 hours, she had filed for a divorce on Charlotte's behalf, citing adultery, emotional neglect, and financial mismanagement. She had also pushed for an emergency hearing to issue a protective order, ensuring Ethan could not intimidate or retaliate. The courts moved swiftly, and by the end of the week, Ethan was served. The documents arrived at his office, delivered in a thick envelope marked urgent legal notice. His assistant, Alyssa Carter, hesitated before placing them on his desk, her gaze filled with something close to pity. Ethan grabbed the envelope, his stomach twisting as he read the first few lines. Charlotte Jameson versus Ethan Jameson, petition for dissolution of marriage. For the first time, reality hit him like a freight train. She wasn't bluffing. She wasn't waiting for an apology or some empty promise of change. She was done. The world Ethan once controlled was slipping through his fingers. Charlotte, meanwhile, had found a strange sense of peace. After months of doubt, she finally felt in control of her own destiny. She had spent too long waiting for Ethan to be the man she thought he was, only to realize he had never been that man at all. Now her focus was on the future of her child, the future of her independence, and the future she would create without Ethan's shadow looming over her. But Ethan was not a man who accepted defeat easily. Desperate to salvage his reputation, he arranged an emergency press conference. Standing before a sea of reporters, he delivered a carefully rehearsed speech, claiming his indiscretions were private matters that had been sensationalized by the media. He painted himself as a man under immense pressure, someone who had made mistakes but was still dedicated to his family. Charlotte watched the broadcast from her father's penthouse, unmoved. Ethan spoke of regret, but there was no true remorse in his voice. It was nothing more than damage control, a pathetic attempt to salvage his name while ignoring the real harm he had caused. The press conference backfired spectacularly. Instead of earning sympathy, Ethan's words were dissected and ridiculed. The public wasn't interested in his excuses. They saw a man trying to manipulate the narrative, a man more concerned about his image than the wife he had betrayed. Social media erupted with condemnation. Ethan Jameson is just another entitled billionaire who thinks rules don't apply to him. Charlotte stood up for herself with grace and strength. We should be celebrating her, not giving Ethan a platform to justify his actions. He didn't apologize. He just tried to explain why cheating and neglecting his pregnant wife wasn't his fault. Pathetic. Within hours, Jameson Enterprises took another hit as major investors began pulling out. Ethan's PR team scrambled to control the damage, but it was already too late. The board of directors held an emergency meeting, and by the end of the week, Ethan was forced to step down as CEO. Humiliation was setting in, and for the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't in control. But Charlotte wasn't done yet. Margaret had uncovered something even more damning than his affair. Ethan hadn't just betrayed Charlotte emotionally. He had put their family's financial security at risk. The money he had funneled into Vanessa Rousseau's so-called art investments was unaccounted for. Millions of dollars missing from Jameson Enterprises' financial records. Ethan had assumed he could cover it up, but his recklessness had left a paper trail. Charlotte now had everything she needed to crush him completely. With Margaret's help, she presented her findings to her father, Robert Harrington, who wasted no time contacting his legal team. If Ethan had stolen from his own company, he wasn't just facing divorce, he was facing criminal charges. Ethan, still reeling from his forced resignation, received the news like a punch to the gut. His father-in-law was petitioning for a full financial audit, one that could lead to fraud investigations. If Charlotte chose to testify, he could be facing serious legal consequences. For the first time, real fear set in. He tried calling Charlotte, but she didn't answer. He sent long, desperate messages, begging her to meet him to talk things through. She ignored them all. Ethan had spent years controlling every aspect of his life, but now he had no control over Charlotte. With every failed attempt, his anger grew. He convinced himself that she was overreacting, that she was ruining their family over a mistake. He even tried blaming Vanessa, but deep down he knew the truth. He had done this to himself. Vanessa, sensing that Ethan was no longer useful, disappeared. She had taken what she needed and moved on, leaving him to deal with the destruction. Charlotte, however, refused to let Ethan's actions define her. As she neared the final months of her pregnancy, she shifted her focus toward advocacy work, using her experience to raise awareness about the struggles women faced in high-profile marriages. She donated heavily to the very shelters her charity gala had supported, ensuring that women who felt trapped in toxic relationships had resources to escape. She had been humiliated in front of the world, but she refused to be seen as a victim. She would rebuild. Ethan's legal troubles worsened as investigators dug deeper into his finances. With mounting evidence, his lawyers advised him to settle the divorce quickly, before things escalated further. Begrudgingly, he agreed to Charlotte's terms: full custody of their child, no financial control, and a hefty settlement that ensured neither she nor the baby would ever have to rely on him. The final blow came when Charlotte gave birth to their son. While Ethan had once imagined himself at her side, holding their newborn together, reality was far different. She didn't call him when she went into labor. She didn't invite him to the hospital. Instead, Robert Harrington stood beside her, the only father figure the child would ever need. Ethan found out about the birth through the news, just like everyone else. The last image of Charlotte that the media captured was one of triumph. Leaving the hospital, she held her newborn son in her arms, looking radiant and unbreakable. She didn't hide from the cameras. She met their gaze head-on, silently showing the world that she had survived. Ethan, once the golden lion of Wall Street, was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. A man who had everything but lost it all. His empire had crumbled, his reputation was in ruins, and his family had moved on without him. Charlotte, on the other hand, had emerged stronger than ever. She had once believed that love and loyalty would be enough to keep her marriage intact. But in the end, she had learned the most valuable lesson of all. True strength lies in walking away from those who don't deserve you. And she never looked back. The day the divorce was finalized, Charlotte Jameson sat in her father's penthouse, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. The city stretched before her, glittering and untamed, but for the first time in months, she felt something close to peace. The weight of Ethan's betrayal, the humiliation of his public scandal, and the exhaustion of fighting for her dignity were still fresh, but the war was over. She had won. It had taken months of strategic planning, a relentless legal battle, and an unshakable will to ensure Ethan faced the consequences of his actions. Now it was official. She was no longer Mrs. Ethan Jameson. She was simply Charlotte Harrington once more, reclaiming the name she was born with, a name that held power and resilience. The settlement had been unforgiving. Ethan, desperate to avoid a criminal investigation, had ceded nearly half of his fortune. His offshore accounts had been frozen, his remaining assets heavily scrutinized, and his reputation beyond repair. He had no stake in Jameson Enterprises anymore, no influence in the corporate world, and no claim to their child. Charlotte had secured full custody, ensuring that Ethan would have no legal right to interfere in their son's life unless she allowed it. Margaret Lee had been clear when delivering the final papers. "You have everything you asked for. He's done." Charlotte had only nodded, knowing that Ethan's downfall wasn't just legal. It was personal, financial, and absolute. The media had been relentless in covering his demise. Just a year ago, Ethan had been hailed as the golden lion of Wall Street, a billionaire untouchable in both power and influence. Now he was a fallen king, a disgraced mogul whose story served as a cautionary tale. The same newspapers that once praised him now ran headlines detailing his downfall. From boardroom to bankruptcy, Ethan Jameson's empire in ruins. Once a Wall Street titan, now a scandalous outcast, Jameson's cheating scandal ends in financial ruin. Charlotte Harrington reclaims her life, the woman who walked away from a billionaire. His name, once spoken with admiration, was now synonymous with failure. But for Charlotte, the most significant victory wasn't in the courtroom or the headlines. It was in the quiet moments where she realized she was finally free. She had spent years playing the role of the devoted wife, believing in the illusion of a partnership that had never truly existed. She had ignored the red flags, excused the distance, convinced herself that love alone could sustain their marriage. But now, standing on the other side of that deception, she saw things clearly. Ethan had never been her partner. He had been her captor. Now she could breathe. The first few weeks after the divorce were surreal. For the first time in a long time, she was able to move without feeling like she was being watched, judged, or controlled. No more staged public appearances. No more forced smiles at events where she played the perfect wife. No more pretending. Instead, she focused on her newborn son, the one thing Ethan had never been able to corrupt. He was her greatest reason for fighting, her strongest motivation to win. She had vowed to protect him from the toxic legacy Ethan would have left behind, and she had succeeded. Her father, Robert Harrington, had been her unwavering support throughout the entire ordeal. He had stood beside her not as a businessman protecting his family's reputation, but as a father who had watched his daughter suffer and refused to let it continue. One evening, as they sat in the penthouse, watching the city lights flicker against the glass, Robert spoke for the first time about Ethan. "You did the right thing, Charlotte," he said, his voice firm but warm. "I should have warned you about him years ago, but you needed to see it for yourself." Charlotte nodded, gripping the mug of tea in her hands. "I just wish I had seen it sooner." Robert shook his head. "It doesn't matter how long it took. What matters is that you walked away with your dignity, and you made sure your son will never grow up under that man's shadow." She exhaled slowly, letting his words settle. She had won, but the scars of Ethan's betrayal still lingered. Despite his financial and public ruin, Ethan hadn't completely disappeared. In the weeks following the divorce, he had tried to reach out, leaving messages that Charlotte refused to answer. At first they were pleading, "I made a mistake, Charlotte. Please just talk to me." Then they turned angry. "You think you've won? This isn't over." And finally they were desperate. "Please, I just want to see my son." But Charlotte never responded. He had made his choice when he walked into that hotel with Vanessa Rousseau. Speaking of Vanessa, she had vanished from the public eye as quickly as she had entered it. Once Ethan's money dried up, so did her loyalty. She had moved on, likely finding a new target to manipulate, leaving Ethan to suffer the consequences alone. Charlotte didn't care where Vanessa went. She was nothing more than a ghost in a story that no longer mattered. Instead, Charlotte focused on rebuilding her life. She returned to her philanthropic work, channeling her experience into creating resources for women trapped in toxic marriages. She expanded the Harrington Foundation's initiatives, ensuring that no woman who wanted to leave an abusive or unfaithful husband would feel powerless to do so. She refused to let her story be one of scandal. She turned it into one of survival and empowerment. One evening, Margaret called with unexpected news. "There's talk of Ethan facing federal fraud charges," she said. "The financial discrepancies we found in his offshore accounts? The SEC is investigating." Charlotte didn't react immediately. She had already cut ties with Ethan, already ensured that his downfall was complete. But hearing that he might face actual prison time was an added weight lifted from her shoulders. Karma had come for Ethan Jameson, and it had come swiftly. Months passed, and life settled into a new normal. Charlotte moved out of her father's penthouse, purchasing a home of her own. A place where she and her son could build a life free from the ghosts of her past. She surrounded herself with people who truly cared for her, people who saw her not as Ethan Jameson's wife, but as Charlotte Harrington, the woman who had fought, survived, and risen from the ashes. Then one afternoon, as she walked through the park with her son bundled in her arms, a familiar face appeared on the newsstand. It was Ethan. But this time there was no power in his stance, no confidence in his eyes. The once golden billionaire was now a broken man. His face lined with exhaustion, his fortune gone, his reputation in ruins. The headline read, "Ethan Jameson declares bankruptcy amid criminal investigations." Charlotte stood there for a long moment, staring at the man who had once believed himself invincible. She had once loved him, once believed in the future they were supposed to have. But that future had been a lie. She smiled softly, pressing a kiss to her son's forehead before turning away. Ethan's story was over. Hers was just beginning. As she walked toward her car, her phone buzzed. A call from a close friend, inviting her to a charity gala where she would be honored for her work supporting women in need. She accepted without hesitation. She had once attended events as Ethan Jameson's wife, the woman in the background. Now she would walk in as the woman who reclaimed her life on her own terms. And this time the world would know her name not because of him, but because of her own strength. Charlotte had won, but more importantly, she had survived. And that was the greatest victory of all. The morning after the news of Ethan Jameson's bankruptcy broke, Charlotte Harrington sat on the terrace of her new home, watching the sunrise paint the Manhattan skyline in soft golds and oranges. She cradled her son in her arms, gently rocking him as he cooed in the early morning light. The world outside was chaotic, still buzzing with the scandal of Ethan's downfall, but in this quiet moment, she felt nothing but peace. It had been a long and brutal battle, one that had taken months of endurance, strategy, and patience. She had fought for her dignity, for her child, and for the future she deserved. Now at last she was free. Ethan was no longer a force in her life, no longer a shadow looming over her every move. The power he once held over her had crumbled along with his empire, leaving him a man with nothing, while she stood stronger than ever. For years, she had built her identity around being Ethan Jameson's wife, believing in the illusion of the life they had crafted together. But that life had never truly belonged to her. It had been built on lies, on manipulation, on the illusion that she was part of something solid. Now, stripped of that title, she was no longer bound by his expectations or his betrayals. She was Charlotte Harrington again, and for the first time in years she felt like herself. She sipped her coffee, scrolling through the morning headlines. The media was relentless in documenting Ethan's downfall. Every major news outlet had dissected his financial ruin, his disgrace, and his fall from power. Ethan Jameson, once a billionaire titan, officially bankrupt. Disgraced CEO faces fraud charges, the end of an empire. Where is he now? Ethan Jameson's shocking fall from wealth and influence. The details were brutal. Jameson Enterprises had collapsed under the weight of legal investigations and financial scandals. The money Ethan had stolen to fund his affair, the fraudulent business transactions, and his reckless arrogance had all caught up to him. With frozen assets, a board of directors that had turned their backs on him, and lawsuits piling up, he had no way out. His penthouse had been seized, his luxury cars repossessed, His once loyal business associates, the same people who had showered him with admiration at lavish corporate galas, now avoided him completely. The man who once dominated Wall Street was now a cautionary tale. A reminder that no amount of wealth could protect someone from their own destruction. Charlotte read the articles with a strange sense of detachment. There had been a time when this news would have devastated her, when she would have felt some lingering love for the man she had married, when she might have even considered reaching out to him. But that time was long gone. Ethan had destroyed their marriage with his betrayal, his lies, and his greed. She had given him everything, her trust, her loyalty, her future. And he had thrown it away for a woman who had never truly cared for him. Now he was alone, abandoned by the very people he had chosen over her. Vanessa Rousseau had disappeared completely. Once the money ran out, so had she. The last time Ethan had reached out to Charlotte was a week before the bankruptcy announcement. His messages had grown increasingly desperate, no longer filled with arrogance but pleas for her to speak to him. "Charlotte, please. I made mistakes, but I don't deserve this. I need to see you. Just talk to me." She had ignored it. Then 2 days later, "I lost everything. I don't know what to do. I just need to see my son. I won't fight for custody. I just want to be in his life. Please." Charlotte had hesitated when she saw that message. For all of Ethan's sins, he was still her child's father. But she reminded herself of the months of silence, of neglect, of the way he had dismissed her pregnancy as an inconvenience while he entertained another woman. He had chosen his priorities, and their child had never been one of them. She never responded. After that, the messages stopped. She assumed he had finally accepted that she was never coming back. Her father, Robert Harrington, had been right about him all along. Ethan had never been a husband, a partner, or a father. He had only been a man who believed himself invincible, until he wasn't. Now Charlotte focused on the future. In the months following her divorce, she had immersed herself in her philanthropy work, turning her experience into a mission to help other women escape toxic marriages. The Harrington Foundation launched a new initiative, one dedicated to providing financial and legal resources for women who felt trapped in relationships where they had no power. She had once been one of those women, tied to a man whose wealth gave him the illusion of control. But she had broken free, and she wanted to ensure that others could do the same. The initiative gained national attention, with powerful women across industries reaching out to support the cause. Charlotte found herself invited to events not as someone's wife, but as a leader, a survivor, a woman with her own voice. One night, as she attended a fundraiser, standing beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers, she caught her reflection in the mirrored walls. For years, she had attended these events as Mrs. Ethan Jameson, always standing slightly in his shadow, always playing the role of the gracious wife. But now she stood alone, holding her own, commanding her own presence. She had survived. One evening, while visiting her father's estate, Robert pulled her aside for a quiet conversation. They sat in his study, the fire crackling softly in the background. "I heard Ethan is staying in a small apartment in Brooklyn," Robert said, his voice even. "No more penthouses. No more personal chauffeurs." Charlotte didn't respond at first. She simply stared at the flames, watching them flicker and twist. "He's facing criminal charges for financial fraud," Robert continued. "There's a strong chance he'll serve time." She exhaled slowly. She had prepared herself for this news, but hearing it aloud still felt surreal. Ethan had once ruled over New York's financial world, sitting at the top of the empire he had built. Now he was barely holding on to the scraps of his former life. Robert watched her carefully. "How do you feel about it?" Charlotte thought about it for a long moment. She had spent so much time angry, heartbroken, humiliated. But now there was no satisfaction in Ethan's suffering, just indifference. "I don't feel anything," she admitted. "He made his choices. This was always how it was going to end." Robert nodded approvingly. That's my girl. Months passed, and life continued to evolve. Charlotte moved into a beautiful townhouse in the Upper East Side, a place where she could raise her son without any reminders of Ethan. She decorated the nursery in soft blues and whites, creating a peaceful space for the child who had been her greatest source of strength through it all. She watched her son grow, his smile filling her world with a joy that Ethan's betrayal could never taint. He was the only part of that marriage worth keeping, the only thing Ethan had ever done that mattered. One day, while walking through the park, she passed a newspaper stand. Ethan's face was on the front page again, but this time it was a mugshot. Former billionaire Ethan Jameson indicted for fraud, facing possible prison sentence. Charlotte didn't stop walking. She had no reason to read it. That was his story. She had already started writing her own. As she reached her car, she glanced down at her son, sleeping peacefully in his stroller. She smiled, brushing a gentle hand over his tiny fingers. The world had once known her only as Ethan Jameson's wife. Now she was Charlotte Harrington, the woman who had survived, fought back, and won. And that was the only title that mattered. Charlotte Harrington woke before dawn, the soft hush of the city stretching out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of her townhouse. The skyline was a quiet silhouette against the deep blue of the morning, the city not yet fully awake. She stood at the window, cradling a cup of tea in her hands, watching as the world slowly stirred to life. It had been months since she last thought about Ethan Jameson, but this morning she allowed herself a brief reflection, not out of longing nor out of anger, but out of sheer disbelief at how far she had come. The name Ethan Jameson had once ruled her world. For years he had been at the center of her universe, the man she had built her life around. But now his name barely meant anything to her. He was a remnant of another life, a version of herself she no longer recognized. Charlotte had stepped into something new, something that was entirely hers. Her mornings were different now. Instead of waking up in a gilded cage, waiting for Ethan's approval or attention, she woke up with purpose. She had a child to care for, a foundation to run, and a life that finally felt like her own. The woman she had become, the woman who had survived, fought back, and built something meaningful, was someone she respected. Today was a big day. It marked the official opening of the Harrington Women's Resource Center, the culmination of months of work, planning, and unwavering dedication. The center was a beacon of hope for women who had once felt as trapped as she had, offering legal aid, financial education, emergency housing, and a network of support for those seeking to leave dangerous or toxic relationships. It was everything she wished had existed when she had first begun to doubt her marriage, when she had felt the weight of betrayal but had nowhere to turn. After getting her son ready for the day, she handed him off to his nanny, a kind, patient woman who treated him like her own, before slipping into the back seat of her car. The drive to the new center was quiet, but inside her thoughts raced. She remembered the first time she had walked into a room full of women who had suffered similar fates, how she had listened to their stories, their struggles, their fears. She remembered how each story sounded a little like her own. A woman who had been told to be patient, to endure, to sacrifice. But she had learned the truth. There was no glory in suffering. There was no virtue in staying silent. And there was no power in being someone else's afterthought. When she arrived at the center, she was greeted by an eager crowd, women, reporters, local leaders, all gathered to witness something that had never existed before. The Harrington name had always been associated with wealth and real estate, but now it would be synonymous with change. She stepped onto the small stage that had been set up in front of the building, the podium waiting for her. As she looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some strangers, she felt a deep, resounding sense of purpose. For years, she had been forced to smile at events like these, standing beside Ethan as he took the credit for achievements she had quietly worked on. Now, for the first time, she was here as herself, and she was finally being heard. She took a steadying breath and began. There was a time when I believed that my worth was tied to someone else's success, she said, her voice clear and strong. That I had to be the perfect wife, the perfect woman, the perfect everything. But the truth is, no woman should have to sacrifice herself to make others comfortable. The audience was silent, listening intently. I stand here today not because I survived my past, but because I chose to rewrite my future, she continued. This center exists because women deserve options. We deserve safety. We deserve to know that walking away is not failure. It is freedom. The crowd erupted in applause, but Charlotte barely heard it. She had already won. After the speech, she spent time walking through the center, shaking hands, talking to the women who would be working there. They were lawyers, therapists, former victims who had become advocates, each of them carrying a story of resilience. One woman, a mother of two, approached her hesitantly. I just wanted to say thank you, she said softly. I left my husband last year. He was controlling. I didn't think I could ever escape. But watching your story unfold in the news, seeing how you fought back, it gave me the courage to leave. Charlotte felt her throat tighten. She had never wanted to be a public figure. She had never wanted her pain to be dissected by the media. Her personal life turned into tabloid gossip. But if even one woman had found the strength to escape because she had watched Charlotte do it first, then it had all been worth it. You did that on your own, Charlotte said, placing a hand on the woman's shoulder. I'm just glad you found your way out. As the event wrapped up, she stepped outside for a moment, breathing in the crisp autumn air. The sun had fully risen now, casting light over the city she had once felt trapped in. Now it was her city. Her phone buzzed. A message from Margaret Lee. Final ruling just came in. Ethan's plea deal has been accepted. 5 years in federal prison. It's over. Charlotte stared at the words for a moment. The final nail in the coffin of a man who had once believed he was invincible. She felt nothing. No joy, no sorrow, just a quiet, peaceful acceptance. Ethan Jameson had been the defining figure of her past, but he had no place in her future. She deleted the message. That evening back home, she sat with her son in his nursery, watching as he played with his stuffed animals. He was growing fast, his eyes bright with curiosity. He would never know the weight of his father's mistakes. He would grow up in a home filled with love, surrounded by people who cared. As she rocked him to sleep, she thought about everything that had led her here, the heartbreak, the humiliation, the betrayal. And yet she would not change a thing, because she had survived it. She had walked through the fire, and instead of being burned, she had emerged stronger. She was no longer Ethan Jameson's wife. She was no longer the woman who had been wronged. She was Charlotte Harrington, and she had won. As she stood by the window, looking out at the city lights, she knew that her story wasn't about what had been done to her. It was about what she had done next. She had walked away from a life that wasn't meant for her. And now she was finally where she was meant to be. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air of Blackgate Federal Prison's infirmary. Ethan Jameson lay motionless on the narrow cot, his face pale, his frame thinner than it had ever been. His breathing was uneven, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for a glass of water beside his bed. The doctors had been monitoring him for weeks, noting his sudden weight loss, fatigue, and dizzy spells. They whispered among themselves about his declining health, murmuring the words he wanted them to say. Liver failure. Terminal. Months left at best. Ethan had spent months perfecting this deception. He had studied symptoms, adjusted his diet, timed his moments of weakness. A few well-placed bribes ensured his medical records reflected exactly what he needed them to. His goal was simple, compassionate release. The system, so eager to appear humane, would let him walk free. He could already picture the headlines. Once mighty business mogul faces his final days. Dr. Samuel Price sat across from him, flipping through a file. his brow furrowed, concern clear in his eyes. Ethan coughed weakly, pressing a hand to his ribs as though in pain. "I just want to see my son," he whispered. The following morning, his case was brought before the prison board. Sympathy carried weight in these rooms, and his medical file left little doubt. A unanimous decision was reached, early release granted. Hundreds of miles away, Charlotte Harrington sat in the quiet of her study, reading the legal document in her hands. Across from her, Margaret Lee's expression was unreadable, though the tension in her jaw spoke volumes. "They granted it," Margaret finally said. "He's being released within the week." Charlotte's fingers curled around the papers, knuckles whitening. She had prepared herself for this possibility, but seeing it confirmed filled her with a cold dread. Ethan had spent years manipulating people, convincing the world he was a man worth admiring. Now he was using the same tactics to gain freedom. Margaret continued, her voice even. "He's positioning himself as a dying man who just wants to see his son before it's too late." Charlotte's stomach twisted. Noah had been spared from knowing his father's true nature, too young to remember the chaos Ethan had caused. Now, Ethan was attempting to claw his way back into their lives, using pity as his weapon. She turned on the television, where a well-groomed news anchor detailed Ethan's tragic fall. The screen shifted to an interview. Ethan sitting in a wheelchair, his frame weak, his voice quiet and remorseful. He spoke of regret, of mistakes made, of wanting one last chance to be a father. His performance was flawless. Charlotte turned off the television. Margaret set down her briefcase. Public perception is shifting. People are sympathizing with him. Charlotte barely heard her. Her mind was already moving ahead, considering the next step. Ethan wasn't dying. He was lying as he always did. The question was, what was he planning? 2 days later, the media was flooded with articles painting Charlotte as an unyielding ex-wife. Public opinion began to shift. Shouldn't a dying man see his son? Why was she keeping a child from his father? Has Charlotte Harrington let her bitterness cloud her judgment? She ignored the noise. The real battle wasn't in headlines. It was in the shadows where Ethan played his games. Robert Harrington's voice cut through the tension as they sat in his office later that evening. "If he tries anything, I'll handle it." Charlotte exhaled. "He doesn't make moves without a reason. This isn't about closure. He wants control." Margaret nodded. "We're filing to reinforce the protective order, but the courts may hesitate. If he's seen as terminally ill, they might push for visitation." Charlotte's grip tightened on her glass. Ethan had always positioned himself as untouchable, but now he was playing the role of a fragile man. It was a new kind of leverage, and she had no doubt he intended to use it. 3 nights before Ethan's release, Charlotte found a white envelope slid under her front door. The security cameras had caught nothing. No visitor, no sign of forced entry. Heart-pounding, she opened it. Inside was a single photograph. Noah, taken earlier that afternoon. The angle suggested distance, someone watching unnoticed. She turned the photo over. 2 words scrawled in familiar handwriting. "See you soon." Her breath hitched. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to steady her racing pulse. Ethan wasn't just planning to re-enter their lives. He was already watching. Margaret's response was immediate. "We need to get ahead of this." Charlotte stared at the photograph, fingers pressing into the paper. She had spent years rebuilding, ensuring Noah was safe, free from the shadows of his father's influence. Now those shadows were creeping back. Ethan had faked his illness, manipulated the courts, and gained his freedom. Now he was coming for their son, and Charlotte wouldn't let him win. The day of Ethan Jameson's release arrived with a wave of media attention. Cameras flashed as he stepped out of Blackgate Federal Prison, appearing frail and weak, his movements slow and deliberate. The carefully cultivated illusion of a dying man was flawless. His once pristine designer suits had been replaced by simple, loose-fitting clothes, the kind that would further reinforce the idea of his deteriorating health. A swarm of reporters crowded around him, shouting questions. Ethan raised a trembling hand, his voice quiet but full of practiced sorrow. "I only have one wish," he murmured, eyes glassy with the weight of his supposed final days. "To see my son before it's too late." The story had gripped the nation. It was the perfect narrative, a fallen billionaire, riddled with regret, seeking redemption in his last moments. Public sentiment was turning in his favor, and Ethan knew it. But behind the weak facade, his mind was sharper than ever. He was far from finished. That evening, Ethan checked into a luxury penthouse under a false name, far from the prying eyes of the press. The interior was sleek, modern, a stark contrast to the sterile gray walls of his prison cell. Vanessa Rousseau was waiting for him. She stood by the bar, swirling a glass of wine, her sharp gaze assessing him. Her once flawless loyalty had been shaken by his downfall, but Ethan knew she was still hungry for power, for the kind of wealth that only a man like him could provide. "You look terrible," she remarked, eyeing the slight slump in his posture, the pallor of his skin. He smirked. "Good. That means the act is working." Vanessa sipped her wine, crossing her arms. "I did my part. Paid off the right people, forged the right documents. You owe me." Ethan moved closer, dropping the frail act entirely. His voice was lower, colder. "And you'll get what you deserve. But first I need to take care of something." Vanessa raised a brow. "Charlotte." His jaw clenched at the name. "She's standing between me and my son. She won't let you near him." Ethan exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the weight of his former captivity. "She doesn't have a choice." Charlotte sat at the long dining table in her townhouse, her father's voice a low hum in the background as he spoke on the phone. Legal documents were spread out before her, along with several news articles sympathizing with Ethan. The headlines painted her as the cold-hearted ex-wife denying a dying man his final wish. It made her stomach turn. Noah was playing in the adjacent room, giggling as he arranged toy soldiers in neat rows. He was safe here, protected. But for how long? Margaret Lee had spent the entire day reinforcing legal barriers, ensuring Ethan had no rights to visitation. Still, the law wasn't always a shield. If Ethan wanted something, he wouldn't play fair. Robert Harrington hung up the phone, his expression grim. He's reaching out to old contacts, people in high places. Some of them still owe him favors. Charlotte's hands curled into fists. What is he planning? Margaret's voice was firm. A legal battle. If he can convince a judge that he deserves visitation, there's a chance he could gain access to Noah. We need to be ahead of this. Charlotte's throat tightened. She had spent years protecting her son from Ethan's toxic influence. She would not let him manipulate his way back in. Ethan moved quickly. Through Vanessa's connections, he arranged a series of private meetings with corrupt officials, judges, attorneys, people who would be willing to bend the law in his favor for the right price. He knew exactly how to exploit public sympathy, how to appear as the loving father denied his final wish. The plan was already in motion. Late at night, in a dimly lit parking garage, Ethan met with Judge Alan Whitmore, a man with a reputation for making problems disappear, for a price. Whitmore leaned against his car, watching Ethan carefully. "You're asking for a lot. You want access to your son despite your history, despite Charlotte's legal team fighting against you. Ethan nodded, slipping a thick envelope into the judge's pocket. I just need the door open a little. Public pressure will take care of the rest. Whitmore hesitated, then nodded once. I'll see what I can do. Ethan smirked. The game was already shifting in his favor. Charlotte woke in the middle of the night to the sound of her phone vibrating against the nightstand. She answered groggily, but Margaret's voice jolted her awake. He filed a petition for visitation. Charlotte sat up abruptly, heart pounding. That fast? Margaret exhaled sharply. And he's already gotten some legal backing. His case is gaining traction. Charlotte swung her legs out of bed, pacing. She could hear Noah's soft breathing from the next room, the steady rise and fall of his little chest. The idea of Ethan getting anywhere near him made her stomach twist. She had to shut this down before it went any further. Ethan's next move was to stage a public appeal. An emotional interview where he spoke directly to Charlotte through the cameras. Seated in a dimly lit studio, with Vanessa watching from the sidelines, he wove his story carefully. His voice cracked at the right moments, his eyes filled with just enough sorrow. I don't have much time left, he said softly. I know I've made mistakes. I regret them more than anyone can imagine, but I can't change the past. All I can do is ask for one thing, the chance to see my son before it's too late. The interview spread like wildfire. Support poured in. People demanded that Charlotte reconsider. She watched it from her office, the weight of it pressing down on her. Her phone rang. Robert. His voice was sharp. This isn't just public sympathy, Charlotte. Ethan's buying influence. He's trying to force the court's hand. Charlotte's mind raced. This was more than a legal battle. Ethan was pulling strings behind the scenes. She turned to Margaret. We need leverage. Something to prove he's lying. Margaret nodded. Then we need to go after the people helping him. Charlotte took a breath, steadying herself. Ethan was coming for Noah, but she wasn't going to let him win. She had fought too hard, escaped too much. This time she was ready. The night was quiet, but Charlotte Harrington had learned that calm was always the prelude to chaos. The townhouse was locked down tighter than ever. Her security detail, handpicked by her father, Robert, remained stationed at every entry point. Cameras monitored the property. Alarms were set. Nothing could happen to Noah. Not with Ethan lurking in the shadows, pulling strings, orchestrating his next move. Charlotte sat in the dim glow of her study, scrolling through the latest media reports. Ethan's sob story was spreading like wildfire, painting her as the cruel mother denying her dying ex-husband his last wish. People had no idea who Ethan truly was, the kind of monster hiding behind those sorrowful, manipulative eyes. But Charlotte knew. She had lived it. A knock at the door startled her. Margaret Lee stepped inside, her face set in grim determination. We've tracked some of Ethan's financial movements, she said, placing a folder on the desk. He's paying off people in the system. Lawyers, court officials. But that's not the worst part. Charlotte's stomach twisted. What is? Margaret hesitated. He made a large payment to someone on your security team. The air thickened. Charlotte's pulse pounded as she reached for the folder. Inside, a single name jumped out at her. Daniel Keene. A man who had been part of her security detail for 2 years. A man she had trusted to keep Noah safe. The realization settled like ice in her veins. Ethan wasn't going to fight this in court. He was going to take Noah. The house remained silent as Charlotte lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, her body stiff with tension. She had sent Robert and Margaret home, but her mind refused to rest. The security cameras were still live, the guards still in place, but an unease had crept into her chest, an instinct she couldn't shake. Then the phone rang. A number she didn't recognize flashed on the screen, but she knew. With shaking fingers she answered. "I have Noah." The world stopped. Charlotte bolted upright, her breath hitching. "Where is he?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's chuckle coiled around her like a noose. "Right now? He's safe, but that depends on you." Charlotte's mind raced. Noah had been inside the house, under protection. Her legs felt numb as she moved, throwing open the door and running down the hall toward Noah's room. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, the bed was empty. His favorite stuffed animal lay discarded on the floor. A window stood partially open, curtains shifting with the night breeze. She pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting back the rising scream in her throat. Ethan had taken her son. Her vision blurred as she turned back to the phone. "You." She couldn't even find the words. "Shua," Ethan cooed, his voice maddeningly calm. "If you want him back, you'll do exactly as I say." Charlotte gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You'll meet me. Alone." She barely heard anything else, her heart pounding so violently it threatened to break through her ribs. "No police," Ethan warned. "No security. No Robert. If I see even a hint of interference, you'll never see him again." Charlotte's chest heaved with ragged breaths. Her son, her baby, stolen from her own home. "I swear, Ethan," she rasped, "if you hurt him, you're wasting time." Ethan interrupted. "Meet me at the docks. Midnight. Come alone." The line went dead. Charlotte's fingers trembled as she lowered the phone. Her mind screamed for action, for movement, but she was frozen, terror pressing down on her like an iron weight. Then something snapped. She turned, storming down the hall, her entire body trembling with fury. She was not helpless. Noah needed her, and she would burn the world down to get him back. The dock stretched out into the cold, black water, mist curling over the surface like ghostly fingers. The smell of salt and oil hung in the air. The distant hum of the city barely reached this desolate place. Charlotte stood in the eerie silence, gripping her coat tighter around her. She had come alone. A figure emerged from the shadows. Ethan. He looked nothing like the weak, dying man he had portrayed on television. He stood tall, unbothered, a twisted smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. And then Noah. He was standing just behind Ethan, his little hand wrapped around the hem of his father's coat. His eyes were wide with confusion, darting between his parents. Charlotte's breath caught. He was unharmed, scared but unharmed. Ethan tilted his head, amusement flickering in his gaze. "I knew you'd come." Charlotte forced herself to stay still, her pulse hammering in her ears. "I did what you asked. I'm here. Now give him to me." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You don't get it, do you?" Charlotte's entire body went rigid. "This isn't about saying goodbye," Ethan continued. "This is about what's mine." The words punched through her like a bullet. "You think you can erase me? Replace me?" His voice sharpened. "Noah is my son too." Charlotte swallowed hard, her fingers twitching with the urge to lunge forward and take her son back. Ethan must have sensed it. He gripped Noah's wrist tightly, holding him close. Noah let out a soft whimper, and it was all Charlotte could do not to break right then and there. She had no leverage, no weapons, no backup. Ethan had planned this perfectly. Then, a flicker of movement in the darkness. Charlotte kept her expression still, but her heart leapt. She wasn't as alone as Ethan thought. She had called Detective Adrian Miles before she left. And now the trap was closing. Ethan was too focused on his victory, too convinced he had the upper hand. He didn't see the silent figures moving through the fog, weapons drawn. A single laser sight landed on his chest. Then, "Drop him!" The command sliced through the air. Ethan stiffened, eyes narrowing. He turned, finally realizing he wasn't in control anymore. Charlotte moved. With every ounce of force she lunged forward, wrenching Noah out of his grip. The little boy collapsed into her arms, clinging to her as she shielded him. Ethan took a step back, realizing he had lost. The officers closed in. "You set me up," he muttered, voice low with rage. Charlotte, her arms wrapped around Noah, finally met his gaze. Her fear was gone. "You did that to yourself." Ethan didn't get the chance to respond. The officers tackled him to the ground. The fight was over before it even began. Charlotte didn't watch. She had her son. That was all that mattered. As she carried Noah away from the docks, his little arms still clinging tightly around her neck, she pressed a soft kiss to his temple. "You're safe," she whispered. "I've got you." And this time she meant it. Because Ethan Jameson was going back where he belonged. And nothing would ever take Noah from her again. Charlotte sat at the edge of her bed, her hands shaking as she reread Ethan's message for the 100th time. It was short, cruelly simple. "Come alone. You know what happens if you don't." Her father, Robert, had ordered a security detail to surround the townhouse, and Margaret had been on the phone with law enforcement all night. Neither of them wanted her anywhere near Ethan, but Charlotte knew better than to listen. The police would be too slow. Her father's men might trigger Ethan's paranoia. If she wanted Noah back alive and unharmed, she had to go alone. She reached into the nightstand and retrieved a small revolver, one she had never used but had kept hidden since the day she realized Ethan would never let her go. Her father's voice boomed through the hall. "Charlotte, don't be reckless. We will find another way." "There isn't another way," she murmured, grabbing her coat. Margaret stepped in front of her, eyes dark with fear. "If you go to him without backup, you might not make it out." Charlotte's grip on her gun tightened. "If I don't go, Noah won't. No more arguments. No more waiting." She was ending this tonight. She turned, stepped past them, and walked out into the night. The mansion loomed ahead, an eerie monument of decay. It had once belonged to Ethan's family, a grand estate on the outskirts of the city. Now it was abandoned, forgotten, much like the man who had brought her here. Her heels crunched against the gravel as she stepped through the iron gates. The mansion's towering windows were dark, its once pristine walls covered in ivy and neglect. The front door was slightly ajar. Charlotte's breath hitched. Inside, candlelight flickered against the cracked wallpaper. The scent of dust and damp would fill the air. And then she saw them. Noah stood at the center of the room, clutching a stuffed animal close to his chest. His little face was pale, his wide eyes filled with confusion, and beside him, Ethan. He was nothing like the frail, sickly man the world had seen on television. His stance was solid, his body strong and unbothered, his mouth curled in a smirk. The deception was over. Charlotte forced herself to remain calm. "I'm here." Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. "You always were predictable." Her gaze darted to Noah, searching for signs of harm. He wasn't hurt, just scared. That was something. "Let him go, Ethan." Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Let him go? Just like you let me go? Just like you took everything from me?" Charlotte's fingers curled into fists. "You destroyed your own life." Ethan's smirk vanished. "I built an empire, and you helped burn it to the ground." Charlotte refused to let his words shake her. She had spent too long letting Ethan dictate the rules of her life. She took a careful step forward. Noah isn't a pawn in your twisted game. Let him go and I'll walk away. No police. No retaliation. Ethan's jaw tightened. You still think you have control over this, don't you? His hand moved to his waistband. Charlotte saw the gun before he even pulled it. Noah let out a small whimper. Don't, Charlotte said quickly, hands raised. You don't want to do this. Ethan's grip on the gun was steady, aimed at her without hesitation. You think I won't? You think I won't end this right here? Her heart pounded in her chest. If you shoot me, Noah will see it. He'll never forget it. For a moment, something flickered in Ethan's eyes, hesitation, doubt. Charlotte used it. She lunged forward, knocking into him with everything she had. The gun clattered to the ground, sliding across the floor. Ethan grabbed her by the throat, shoving her backward. Charlotte gasped, struggling against his grip. Noah screamed. Charlotte's hand scrambled toward her pocket, fingers closing around the cool metal of her revolver. With all the strength she had left, she slammed the barrel against Ethan's ribs and pulled the trigger. The gunshot rang out, echoing through the hollow mansion. Ethan stumbled back, a hand clutching his side, eyes wide with disbelief. Blood stained his shirt, spreading rapidly. Charlotte gasped for air, chest heaving as she scrambled toward Noah, pulling him into her arms. Ethan staggered against the wall, blinking rapidly. He let out a breathless chuckle. You finally fought back. Charlotte stood, her gun still aimed at him. It's over. Ethan looked up at her, and for the first time she saw real fear in his eyes. He knew it too. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Charlotte lifted Noah into her arms and turned away, walking toward the mansion's entrance. Toward freedom. Behind her, Ethan slumped to the ground, his reign of terror finally coming to an end. For good. The mansion reeked of dust and decay, its once grand halls now filled with echoes of the past. The candlelight flickered, casting long shadows against the cracked walls, illuminating the chaos unfolding within. Charlotte's heart pounded in her chest, her pulse roaring in her ears as she shielded Noah, her trembling hands clutching his tiny frame against her own. Ethan staggered but remained upright, a hand pressed against his bleeding side, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. He had underestimated her. He had always believed she would remain the woman he could control, the woman who would never dare pull the trigger. But Charlotte had changed. She was no longer his to manipulate. His breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. You think this is over? His voice was hoarse, his eyes wild. I'm not done, Charlotte. I'll never be done. Charlotte tightened her grip on Noah. Every muscle in her body coiled and ready to run. But she knew Ethan too well. He wouldn't let her just walk away. Ethan lunged toward them. Charlotte flinched, twisting to protect Noah just as a gunshot rang out. The sound split the silence, reverberating through the hollow mansion like a crack of thunder. Ethan jerked backward, a sharp gasp escaping his lips before his body collapsed to the floor. Charlotte whirled around, her eyes landing on the figure standing in the doorway, a gun still raised, Detective Adrian Miles. The tension in her chest shattered, relief crashing over her like a tidal wave. Adrian stepped forward, his gaze locked on Ethan, who lay sprawled on the floor, blood seeping from his wound. His expression was unreadable, but his tone was cold, final. It's over, Jameson. Ethan let out a wheezing laugh, his arrogance faltering as pain overtook him. He tried to push himself up, but his strength was draining fast. Charlotte didn't waste another second. She turned, kneeling before Noah, who clung to her, his tiny hands fisting the fabric of her coat. His face was buried against her shoulder, his little body trembling. It's okay, baby, she whispered, pressing a kiss to his forehead. I've got you. The room swirled with movement as more officers stormed inside, weapons drawn. Voices overlapped, commands, shouts, the scuffle of boots against the worn wooden floor. Ethan didn't resist. He was too weak now, his body betraying him at last. Charlotte slowly stood, Noah still held tightly in her arms as Adrian approached. "You okay?" His voice was lower now, softer, a stark contrast to the authority he had wielded just moments ago. Charlotte nodded, though she wasn't sure if she believed it yet. "I am now." Adrian studied her for a moment, then turned back to Ethan. The once mighty billionaire, the man who had once commanded power with a mere glance, was now reduced to a criminal lying in his own blood. A team of paramedics rushed inside, assessing Ethan's wounds, their expressions detached, professional. One of them muttered, "Gunshot wound to the abdomen, severe blood loss." Ethan chuckled weakly, his bravado crumbling. "Guess I won't be faking this one, huh?" Charlotte watched, unmoving, as the paramedics worked, their voices methodical. They strapped Ethan onto a stretcher, an officer cuffing his wrists to the rails. As they lifted him, his gaze locked onto Charlotte's. Even now, even as he lay broken and defeated, there was something hauntingly familiar in his expression. A quiet, twisted admiration. "You finally fought back," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Proud of you." Charlotte turned away. Ethan Jameson was nothing to her now. Outside, the air was cold, the sky a deep navy canvas speckled with the distant glow of city lights. Emergency vehicles lined the property, their flashing lights bouncing off the abandoned mansion's crumbling façade. Charlotte stood near Adrian's car, her arms wrapped tightly around Noah, who had finally fallen asleep against her chest, exhaustion claiming him after the nightmare he had just endured. Robert Harrington's voice cut through the night air as he approached, his steps quick and urgent. "Charlotte!" His breath came out heavy as he reached her, eyes scanning over both her and Noah, making sure they were unharmed. She let him pull her into a firm embrace, the weight of everything settling into her bones. "He's gone, Dad," she murmured against his shoulder. "He's gone," Robert exhaled, pressing a hand against the back of her head. "And he's never coming back." Margaret arrived next, her usual calm composure cracked with concern. "They're taking Ethan straight to a maximum security medical unit. Once he recovers, he's looking at life without parole." The words lingered, sinking deep. Charlotte knew Ethan would never truly be gone. He had left scars, one she would carry forever. But he would never hurt her or Noah again. Later that night, Charlotte sat in Noah's bedroom, watching as he slept, his little face peaceful once more. His stuffed bear was tucked under his arm, his chest rising and falling in gentle, steady breaths. She brushed a soft curl from his forehead, swallowing down the emotions that threatened to spill over. This was what she had fought for. Not revenge. Not justice. Peace. Adrian leaned against the doorway, his arms crossed. His presence was quieter now, the sharp edges of the night's events beginning to soften. "You did good tonight," he said. Charlotte let out a slow breath. "I did what I had to do." Adrian nodded. "And now you get to live." Charlotte looked down at Noah, a small true smile breaking through the exhaustion. For the first time in years she believed it. The headlines the next morning were exactly what Charlotte had expected. Ethan Jameson captured. Kidnapping and assault charges added to his record. Fallen billionaire taken into custody. No parole this time. Ex-wife escapes final showdown with disgraced financier. The story spread fast, painting Ethan Jameson as a criminal mastermind brought down by his own arrogance. His face, pale, blood-stained, exhausted, was plastered across every major news outlet. The once mighty Mogul, the man who had ruled Wall Street and manipulated the system to his advantage, was now nothing more than an inmate in a maximum security prison. There were no more loopholes, no more forged medical records, no more lies to secure his freedom. The legal system had given him one chance, and he had thrown it away the moment he decided to steal Noah. Margaret had been firm when she called Charlotte that morning. "He won't be getting out, Charlotte. He's done. No parole, no special privileges. This time it's permanent." Charlotte had listened, silent, letting the weight of those words sink in. For so long, she had lived with the fear that Ethan would always find a way back, that he would never stop chasing her, never stop trying to reclaim the control he had lost. Now for the first time she could breathe. A month passed. Charlotte sat in the backyard of her townhouse, watching Noah run across the lawn, his laughter ringing through the crisp autumn air. He was smiling again, playing without fear, without shadows lurking over him. Her father had tightened security around her home, but for the first time she didn't feel like a prisoner in her own life. Margaret had finalized the restraining orders, ensuring that even from prison, Ethan could never legally contact her or Noah again. Detective Adrian Miles had assured her that the FBI was monitoring Ethan's movements inside the prison, cutting off any access to outside influence. No more bribes, no more secret connections. Ethan was truly alone. For the first time in years, Charlotte felt like she had her life back. One evening, Robert invited her over for dinner. They sat in his expansive penthouse, the city lights twinkling behind them. Charlotte swirled her wine glass absent-mindedly, lost in thought. "You're still waiting for something to go wrong," Robert observed. She looked up, sighing. "I can't help it." Her father leaned back in his chair. "It's over, Charlotte. Ethan can't hurt you anymore." She nodded, but deep down part of her still wasn't sure. Ethan had always been ruthless, always found a way to manipulate people. Could he really be locked away forever? Robert reached over, covering her hand with his. "No more looking over your shoulder." Charlotte wanted to believe him. She really did. Months passed, and life settled into something that resembled normal. Charlotte returned to her philanthropic work, expanding her foundation to help women escaping toxic marriages and domestic abuse. She spoke at events, helped raise funds for shelters, and became an advocate for women in situations like the one she had escaped. Every morning she dropped Noah off at school, kissed his forehead, and told him she loved him. Every night, she read him stories until he fell asleep, watching his little chest rise and fall, knowing he was safe. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what waited around the corner. But nightmares still came. She dreamed of Ethan watching her, his eyes filled with the same dangerous hunger. She dreamed of locked doors that he always managed to open. She dreamed of running, always running, but never being able to escape him. She woke up in cold sweats, the sheets twisted around her. But in the morning, the sunlight always reminded her that she was free. One afternoon, while picking Noah up from school, Charlotte's phone buzzed with a call from Margaret. "I have news," Margaret said, her voice unreadable. Charlotte's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Tell me." Margaret hesitated. There was an attempt on Ethan's life in prison. Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. He survived, Margaret continued. But he's in bad shape. Broken ribs, internal bleeding. He won't be a threat to anyone for a long time. Charlotte didn't know what to feel. Relief? Pity? Indifference? All she could do was stare at the school entrance as Noah came running toward her, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. She ended the call. Ethan was paying for his sins, and for the first time in years she truly believed it was over. But across the city, inside a dimly lit prison cell, Ethan Jameson was still smiling. Even through the pain, even as his body ached from the beating, his mind remained sharp. This wasn't the end. Not for him. Not for Charlotte. He had lost the battle, but he had never lost the war. And one day, when no one was expecting it, he would rise again. He just had to wait. The winter air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and distant roasted chestnuts from the nearby vendors. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the sky, landing softly on the pavement of Central Park. Charlotte pulled her coat tighter around herself as she walked beside Noah, watching him skip ahead, his small boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. His cheeks were flushed pink from the cold, but his laughter was warm, filling the empty spaces in her heart. For the first time in years, Charlotte felt free. The past was behind her. Ethan was gone, locked away in a maximum security prison where he belonged. Noah was safe, their lives no longer dictated by fear or shadows. She had fought harder than she ever thought possible, endured more than she imagined she could, and now she was finally at peace. Noah stopped near a park bench, stretching his arms out to the sky as he tried to catch snowflakes in his mittens. Charlotte smiled, snapping a quick picture on her phone. A moment worth remembering. Then something shifted. A presence. A feeling she couldn't shake. She turned, scanning the park. Parents with strollers. Joggers bundled in scarves. Tourists taking photos of the snow-covered trees. And then, a woman stood near the entrance to the park, partially hidden beneath the hood of her black coat. Even from a distance, Charlotte recognized the smirk. Vanessa Rousseau. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. Vanessa's hair was darker than before, her makeup more subtle, but the sharpness in her eyes remained the same. There was no urgency in the way she stood, no immediate threat, just a quiet presence watching. Their eyes met. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, her lips curving just enough to hint at amusement. Then she turned and disappeared into the crowd. Charlotte's body remained frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. Vanessa was back, and she hadn't come to reminisce. That night, Charlotte sat in her study, staring at her phone, debating, calling Adrian, calling Margaret, calling her father. But what would she say? Vanessa Rousseau was in the park today. That wasn't a crime. It wasn't enough to send authorities after her, not enough to drag Vanessa into the light and demand answers. And yet Charlotte knew. Vanessa had been Ethan's closest confidant, the woman who had helped him cover up his crimes, launder his stolen money, orchestrate his deception. She had vanished after Ethan's arrest, slipping into the shadows before anyone could question her role in his downfall. But now she was back, and she had made sure Charlotte saw her. Days passed. Charlotte carried on with life, taking Noah to school, attending board meetings for her foundation, doing everything she could to pretend that Vanessa hadn't unsettled her. But the feeling lingered. The unease, the paranoia, the sensation that someone was always watching. One afternoon while shopping for groceries, she felt it again. A fleeting glance. A woman in a cafe window staring just a little too long. A figure standing near the entrance of a boutique, only to disappear when Charlotte turned. It was subtle, just enough to let her know it wasn't her imagination. Vanessa was playing a game, and Charlotte had no idea what the rules were.
Understand the
One evening, a letter arrived at her townhouse. No return address. Inside, a single piece of expensive stationery, carrying only 2 words in delicate, elegant handwriting. Miss me. Charlotte's stomach dropped. She gripped the note tightly, her hands trembling with rage and something deeper, fear. This wasn't just a message. It was a warning. Vanessa wasn't just watching. She was waiting. For what? Charlotte didn't know. But she intended to find out. As we step into 2025, Shadows of Deception serves as a compelling reminder of the power dynamics, resilience, and dangers that persist in our modern world. The story highlights the impact of manipulation, the importance of trusting one's instincts, and the strength it takes to break free from toxic cycles. In an era where technology makes deception easier and public perception can be swayed by carefully curated narratives, Charlotte's journey warns us to look beyond appearances and question the truth behind persuasive voices. It also emphasizes the necessity of support systems, legal, emotional, and personal. Charlotte's survival and ultimate triumph were not only due to her own strength, but also because she had people like Margaret, Adrian, and her father Robert standing beside her. This reflects real-life challenges faced by many, especially women, who are trying to escape manipulative relationships, financial control, or emotional abuse. Finally, the story reminds us that the past doesn't always stay buried. Just as Vanessa reemerges from the shadows, 2025 will continue to bring challenges that test our resilience. But like Charlotte, we must remain vigilant, stand firm in our convictions, and never let fear dictate our future. Charlotte Harrington has fought harder than anyone could have imagined. She survived the manipulation, the betrayal, and the fear. She stood against Ethan Jameson's deception, protected her son from being used as a pawn, and finally reclaimed the life that was stolen from her. But just when she thought it was over, a shadow from the past has returned. Vanessa Rousseau. Vanessa's reappearance isn't just a coincidence. She's watching, waiting, planning. But for what? Is she seeking revenge for Ethan's downfall? Is she working on his behalf from the outside? Or does she have her own dangerous agenda? Charlotte has come too far to let another threat take hold of her life. She needs to act before it's too late. What should she do next? Should she confront Vanessa directly and demand answers? Should she go to Detective Adrian Miles and uncover what Vanessa has been up to? Or should she prepare for the worst? Because what if Ethan's influence isn't truly gone? Tell us what you think. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What should Charlotte's next move be? Should she run, fight, or dig deeper into Vanessa's plans? Your voice matters, and together, we can help Charlotte win this final battle.